My name is Sarit Chubi. I'm one of the Z3 committee members, and I'm happy to introduce this final breakout session. Can everybody hear me? No? How about now? Okay, my name is Sarit Chubi. I'm one of the committee members on the Z3 committee, and I'm happy to welcome you to the last breakout session. Just so you know, after this, we're going to have a special closing plenary with an incredible panel and a Hanukkah menorah lighting, and also songs from the Maccabees. We actually had a new song commissioned by them for us. If you could be sure to silence your cell phones, and we're going to try to have a Q&A afterwards for you. The panel today is going to be moderated by Debbie Cohen, who's also on the Z3 committee, and she's the founding chair of the Israel Center, served as the director of San Franciscans for Good Government, and as the associate director of the Pacific Northwest region of APAC. And you can read more about all of our panelists in the Connects Me app, and I'll let Debbie introduce them. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. It's the end of the day. We need some energy. If you're in the back of the room, I want this to feel close and personal. So please come on up so we can really have a conversation. Make sure everybody's in the right room. Contemporary Zionism. Contemporary Zionism.
Oh my gosh.
Are we okay? Is this good? Okay. Contemporary Zionism. A new synthesis between particularism and universalism. Okay, I'll be honest. I am honored and, quite honestly, a little bit awed to be able to moderate this panel. Each panelist, a scholar, a thought leader, a PhD, a master teacher, an author, all of them in their own right. So I feel humbled, and I'm very excited about this conversation. My hope is that we can transform a traditional presentation into a real conversation. And I know I've been here since the early morning. I know how hard that is, but that's my hope. I'd like you to all reflect on how the tension between universalism and particularism lives inside of you. It's not just about what the speakers are going to share with us. It's about how does this affect our real daily life. I've asked the panelists to add their personal perspective as well. My P and U, which we will be using a few times today because they are very long words that take up a lot of time, have always lived pretty harmoniously within me. But I have observed a growing intergenerational challenge around this topic, commonly expressed between millennials and their parents and their grandparents about the complementary or conflicting nature of Jewish P and U. So often, particularly from my experience in the Bay Area, the nuance of this conversation is lost using a simplified axis. Universalism is the domain of liberalism and the left, while particularism uses a narrow and conservative lens. While many millennials, and I wish there were more in the room, are promoters of ethnic pride in America, they view Jewish P often with discomfort. On a very real and personal level, families have lost the tools and the vocabulary to discuss how to authentically integrate both. My hope is that this workshop could begin to address that challenge. And this is what I've asked of the speakers. How does this discussion manifest itself here and in Israeli society, where it is, I think, in some cases radically different? What are the commonalities and differences? Can a new synthesis between particularism and universalism be reached? And what would it look like, again, in a new Z3 framework? And can contemporary Zionism energize a meaningful conversation, not just today, but going forward on issues of our common destiny and ethos? Okay, This is probably the way most of your days have gone. Each panelist is going to be given 5 to 7 minutes to try to give their own take, their own lens on that big, broad subject. I'm praying that we have somewhere between 20 minutes to a half an hour for conversation and questions, and then we'll give every panelist 2 minutes to close up. So start thinking now. And you want to join us? Fifth chair. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to give briefer than usual intros, not as brief as our friend David Myers would like me to give, but briefer than they gave me, so we have more time. I'm not going to share the list of their esteemed alma maters. Suffice it to say, their parents are very, very, very proud. Okay, our first panelist, I'm sure many of you have studied with him, is Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer. He's the president of Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and a leading thinker and author on the meaning of Israel to American Jews, the value of the Jewish past to the Jewish present, and questions of leadership and change in American Jewish life. Yehuda leads the efforts across the North American Jewish communal landscape. I won't ask for hands, but I'm sure many of you have studied with him, and teaches widely in the Institute's many platforms for rabbis, lay leaders, Jewish professionals, and leaders of other faith communities. He served as a member of faculty and was the inaugural chair of Jewish Communal Innovation at Brandeis University. So that we have geographic representation, Yehuda resides primarily in New York. Next, Dr. Shlomi Ravid, in a past life, my partner in crime. Shlomi is the executive director of the Center for Jewish Peoplehood Education. Shlomi's been a pioneer in developing peoplehood education. All of you who saw this book, this is Shlomi Ravid in a little framework. In his 25 years, which I think is way longer than 25 years, in global Jewish affairs, he was the founding director of the Israel Center of San Francisco, the International School for Jewish Peoplehood Studies at Beit HaTfutzot, and on the founding team of the Jewish Peoplehood Hub. He's initiated, edited numerous publications and articles on what topic? Peoplehood. And he is a member of, geographically, Kibbutz Glil Yam, near Herzliya, where he lives with his wife Linda, originally from San Francisco, and their 4 beautiful children. Moving to Los Angeles, Dr. David Myers holds the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, where he serves as the director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. Got it right this time, right? Okay. He is past president and CEO of the Center for Jewish History in New York, served as chair of the UCLA History Department, director of the UCLA Center for Jewish Studies. These people, and they're very young. I mean, there's a lot to do. He has written, he has taught from Israel to Paris to Moscow and throughout the US, including for the Wexner Heritage Foundation. He serves as co-editor of the Jewish Quarterly Review, and in October, David was elected as president of the board of the New Israel Fund. I'm handing it off to them. I will be back for all of you. I'll give you a little Tova. Okay, so on Friday, I had a conversation with Tova. I feel like we're old friends, that I've already done this before. I'm so sorry. Dr. Tova Hartman is the Dean of Humanities at Ono Academic College, the largest private college in Israel established to foster inclusiveness and multicultural education. For any of you who don't know about Ono College, I suggest afterwards to talk to Tova and learn more. It's unbelievable. Tova is the author of numerous books, including a National Jewish Book Award winner. Throughout her academic career, listen carefully, I had to read it 4 or 5 times.
You can skip it.
No, I can't. Has focused on critical intersections of gender, identity, and culture. She's used developmental psychology and feminist theory to elucidate the interplay among individual identity formation and the cultural trends of traditional religious societies. Many people.
I don't know, but who wrote it?
Tova is many things, but many of you also know her as one of the founders of Shir HaDashah in Jerusalem, the first Orthodox egalitarian synagogue. And now, unless I've forgotten someone else who's not in the room, I'll come back. I'll pass it on to Yehuda, and I'll give you each kind of a 1 minute. Okay? Thanks.
Thank you, Debbie.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Debbie. And I share, based on your introductions and knowing the folks who I'm sitting with, it's a great honor to be in conversation with all of you. I want to do something a little bit terrible, which is to take this opening dichotomy, Universalism and Particularism, and instead of giving a take on the binary, to challenge the binary. And I'm sure that many of my colleagues on this panel are going to do so as well. And part of my desire in challenging this binary, and I'm going to speak primarily about the American Jewish experience, and I'm sure we can speak about how this tension or this binary is understood among Israelis on the other side. The reason I want to challenge it is because part of what happens when we set up this kind of Hegelian dichotomy, universalism versus particularism, it enables us too quickly to caricature expressions on either end, and to do so in ways that then strip us of the understanding of how significant both of these ideas actually are, and just pushes us towards a kind of mushy middle. Like a little bit of universal is good, a little bit of particular is good also, and I'm not sure that that's quite right. The reason I push against this binary is because based on everything that I have studied in Jewish tradition, I think our tradition actually, with exceptions obviously, demands us to understand that universalism and particularism are not two ideas on a spectrum that we're supposed to locate ourselves in the middle of, but that we are meant to understand the particular as always in service of the universal. In other words, particularism is the instrument towards the fulfillment of universal values. And the way in which I want to portray this, and I'm going to do like my take on the Bible in 60 seconds, maybe less, is imagine the Bible, the whole story of the Bible, the story of Tanakh as an hourglass. The opening story of the Hebrew Bible is God creating a universal vision for the world with a human being created without reference to nationality, ethnicity, family, or group identity. And it seems to be the goal of the creation of the world that should be possible. Human beings living in harmony with the world, with God, and the fulfillment of universal values. Within 8 chapters, that demonstrates itself to not really work. And the next great move of the Bible is the narrowing of the hourglass from the universal vision to let me try. God tries to do something different. Instead of simply creating a universal family, let me focus on one particular family that's going to achieve those goals. But even in that process, the instructions to Abraham are vested with the goal of focusing on this family is the redounding of justice and righteousness for the larger world. In other words, as the Bible narrows from a universal vision to a particular expression, it's not abandoning the ultimate goal, it's simply asking what's the more effective instrumental tool to achieve that. And the way we know that that's really the story is by the time you get to the end of the Bible, right, which you've gone through this whole, the narrow part of the hourglass, the main critique of the prophets against the Israelites is that they have become so focused on the particular, they have forgotten how to turn their society into an instrument for the goodness and betterment of the larger world. I want to take that metaphor and position it as how I understand the interplay between these values. It's not that we have to be a little bit particular and a little bit universal, or we have to make sure that we avoid falling off on one or the other, but that we have to remember that our investment in particularism is meant to serve a universal objective. It's meant to serve a universal goal. The rub then, the tricky part in contemporary Jewish life, and I think especially among American Jews, is as follows. As I experience generation gaps, it's not really, as I understand it, a difference between particularism and universalism. It's a difference between one particularism and a different particularism. The young Jews that I know are actually very tied in to an understanding of what it means to be part of the Jewish people and how they're obligated. They just have a different set of shortcuts of which Jewish values help to achieve those universal goals. Being committed to justice and righteousness is not commitment to universalism. That's a commitment to a Jewish idea that's meant to influence the larger world and a sense of global responsibility. The problem is twofold. The big referendum, I think, in Jewish life, again, is not between particular and universal. It's, does a nation state of the Jewish people facilitate the particularism towards universalism, or is it actually getting in the way? Right? So for a percentage of the Jewish world that sees itself in the terms that are usually traditionally defined as pro-Israel, the nation state is a necessary instrument for the Jewish people for their safety and survival and to be able to advance a vision for the world that is larger than ourselves. And they have a lot more patience about what the nation state can do and do wrong in that process. And for a younger generation of Jewish life, and I don't think it's always perfect, these generational divides, but I think this one is pronounced, there's a tremendous impatience and possibly even the belief that the expression of Jewish particularism in the form of a nation state is not aiding the objective of the Jewish people being leaders on the world stage, but is actually becoming a profound obstacle. That if our goal ultimately is to advance justice and righteousness, maybe the structure of a nation state is not an instrument to that end, but actually a profound obstacle. I guess the second variable where I think we're getting hung up, which is a corollary of this issue, is the question then of who are the significant others or the partners for the Jewish people in the world for the achievement of our objectives. If you're on team nation state, then you will identify as your significant others in the world those who support the idea of a Jewish nation state and who may not care about your larger theological objectives for the world. They may believe in a messianic vision that is at odds with your ultimate vision of what you want to achieve, but they're going to be with you as a partner in that building of a nation state, and you will imagine them as your significant other. Whereas if you believe that a nation state is actually an obstacle for the Jewish particularism to advance universal visions, you're going to look for partners and significant others in the American context who are equally skeptical about nationalism and nation states as not being instrumental towards Jewish values in the world, but actually as being obstacles. My hope is just to start the conversation with this approach, because I think the really hard work that we're going to have to do in Jewish communal life to hold these pieces together is to actually ask if we allow it to be the particular versus the universal, then you almost make it a condition under which that conflict is intractable. What I'm excited by is by the prospect of engaging a real deep debate of Jewish particularism against Jewish particularism. Because then what we're doing is we're actually taking seriously that visions of what the core purpose of what the Jewish people are about are both sincere and they're both real. And it also takes seriously that the changing conditions of the 20th century, which brought the Jewish people a nation state, are actually as remarkable and miraculous as they are, they're really hard. Because they took the Jewish people out of this clean trajectory, peoplehood as an instrument to something to larger in the world, and gave us a test case within the form of a nation state to ask whether or not that was an inhibitor for the Jewish vision of ourselves, or a catalyst. So I wanted to start us off with that orientation, and I'm curious to hear what my colleagues have to say as well. Go ahead, Shlomi.
Thanks. So I'm going to begin with something conceptual, and it's actually interesting. It's going to be different, but I think that the two may complement each other. It's just going at it from a very different angle. And because there's so much to say, I'm going to read. I apologize. Basically, normative systems, i.e. systems that produce norms, cultural norms or norms of behavior, are constituted by a set of core values and interests. Those core values and interests can conflict. In order to operate within a system, within a systemic context, they need to reach a balance. It is necessary as a means to constitute a system that can produce norms and to avoid internal conflicts. What is important to remember for the sake of this current conversation, I'm going to highlight two things. One, the various values and interests are all present in the system. In other words, when we discuss the Jewish people, both particularistic considerations, such as the well-being of the people and its continuity, and universalistic considerations, such as pursuing justice and tikkun olam, are present and at play. It's not either or. They're both within the system. The balance that I described that is necessary for their functioning is dynamic. It changes and is achieved through a change in the meaning and priority within the system. In other words, the prioritization of a certain interest and value demand the adjustment within the system, or deprioritization, which I don't think is an English word, of the other values and interest in the system. In very simplistic terms, prioritizing of particularistic interest will come at the price of emphasis on universalistic values and vice versa. When we try to analyze what is going on with Jewish peoplehood in the last decade or so, we do it through the prism of the paradigm of the second half of the 20th century. That's where we come at it. In the post-Holocaust, and I'm responding to your question, Debbie, in the post-Holocaust and Jewish rebuilding era, highlighting the particularistic agenda of the Jewish people made sense and was perceived as just and ethical by most Jews. We are, however, in a new paradigm whereby American Jews, and the young ones in particular, are seeing the prioritization of the particularistic needs and interests of Jews as ethically challenging, partly because they perceive the Jews as a privileged group. Prioritizing a privileged group seems to them as unethical and conflicts with actual Jewish values which they prioritize. I want to jump to the reality. I ran a project in the Bay Area over the last 2 years, and we surveyed the different institutions that we worked with at the end. And we asked them, what is a priority for your institution? At the top of the list, 82% said that pursuing social justice, 82% wanted pursuing social justice, described it as the top priority of their organization. Particularistic agenda, and Israel was seen as one of them, only received 40%. The Israeli side is a different story. It seems to be digging deeper into the 20th century particularistic paradigm. This enables, among others, the justification of the occupation, a mistreatment of asylum seekers, the scary internal economic gaps, and disrespect for Jewish pluralism. It is showing the signs of particularism trumping all other considerations. Very concerning. This further complicates our challenge. The question becomes not just what kind of a balance between particularism and universalism can be reached that will resonate with young Jews and hold water. At the same time, it raises the questions if we can altogether sustain a common Jewish ethos going forward. Question mark. Final sentence. I would not be in this work if I didn't think we could do something about it. The only way I know to reconfigure our collective ethos and agenda is through a meaningful exploration and explication of the meaning of our collective Jewish destiny and enterprise. What is our message to ourselves and the world? Why is it important? Where is the added value? And I hope that this conference will be a good step in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Shlomi and Yehuda. It's great to be here with you. It's a real honor to be here with my friends and fellow panelists. What I'd like to do is to, in a certain sense, fuse together the topic of this session with the topic of the conference and read the question of universalism and particularism through the prism of Zionism. And in doing so, I want to do three things. I want to identify a problem. I want to look at history and the historical roots of it, because I'm an historian, and that's sort of what I do. And then I want to propose a solution. So the good news is that the bad news will be followed by the good news. So let me begin with Zionism. which I would say stands in a state of crisis as a term and as a broader historical concept. And my evidence for that is what I see on college campuses. There are conflicting statistical analyses of the attitudes of young American Jews, which we can talk about. But what I see, and this is anecdotal evidence, is a sense of disengagement and alienation from the concept of Zionism, in no small part because it is seen as the embodiment of particularism without a sufficient balancing counterforce of universalism. It also has a lot to do with the fact that young Jews today ask a very different question than previous generations who were rooted in and promoted the ideals of Zionism. The question that I hear, for which we all need to find an answer, is why should I care? Why should it matter to me? It's a very different question than the question my generation and older generations before me asked of themselves, which is what can we do to assure the ongoing existence of the Jewish people? It was a question very much formed in the shadow of the Holocaust and had that sense of existential urgency to it. Younger generations whom I interact with very often don't have that sense of existential urgency, and one of the ways in which that is manifested is in a sense of detachment from Zionism and from Israel at large. We can talk about the countervailing influence of birthright, and I'm just sharing with you what I see as someone who operates in the college campus environment. I'd say there's a broader problem with Zionism, apart from the perception of, say, young American Jews. And that is, and this is, Debbie asked us to reflect personally, so here I want to interject my own personal ambivalence towards the concept as it exists today, because I believe that the term Zionism has essentially been commandeered by the right and the religious right since 1967. Here, really following on the vision of the son of the great chief rabbi, Ashkenazi chief rabbi, Rabbi Kook, his son Tzvi Yehuda Kook. His imparted a vision that I think to a certain extent has really won the day and captured the terminological and conceptual debates about what Zionism is. And that is a very ethnocentric, particularist understanding of Israel as a place of a chosen, distinct, unique, and exclusive nation state that doesn't have the same aspiration to participate in the wider community of nations the world over. And I think the foremost culmination of that vision in recent legislative acts is the nation-state law of July 2018, which really accentuated the Jewishness of Israel and Zionism and left behind the democratic piece. And I mentioned that because when I do think of the Zionism that engages and inspires me, it is the vision articulated in Israel's own Proclamation of Independence, which on one hand lays out a narrative of the return of the Jewish people to their land, a narrative of the redemptive qualities of the Zionist project, and at the same time articulated the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice for people of all race, religion, and sex, according to the words of Israel's Proclamation of Independence. Now, very interestingly, one word that is conspicuously absent in Israel's Proclamation of Independence is democracy. And in fact, there were all sorts of fascinating debates amongst the formulators of the proclamation about whether the term democracy should be included. One very particular advocate who later became a Supreme Court justice, Tzvi Berenson, lost the day. And that's, I think, a deficiency. But nonetheless, the overall gist of the document embodies Zionist values and, I think, an equipoise between particularism and universalism that I resonate with. In a certain sense, a completion of the Proclamation of Independence is a basic law passed by the Knesset in 1992, the Basic Law on Human Dignity and Liberty, which does enshrine in Israel as a legislative matter carrying the weight of a constitutional amendment, enshrine the principle of Israel as both a Jewish and democratic state. So the Proclamation of Independence and that basic law form, in a certain sense, the counterweight to what followed, which is, over the last decade, a series of legislative acts that diminished the importance of democracy and I think the universal principle of democracy on behalf of the principle of the Jewishness of the state. And again, the nation-state law is the embodiment of that recalibration of the balance, whereby democracy almost doesn't appear, not in form, in name or deed. So the principle of democracy doesn't appear in the Proclamation of Independence, but principles associated with it anchor that document, whereas not so in the case of the nation-state law of 2018. So that's the bad news. The good news is that there are actually historical roots for a democratic dimension to the Zionist project, and I think to a more perfect balance between particularist and universalist sensibilities. One thinks back to the founding fathers of the Zionist and the founders of the Zionist project and can see the struggle to find a balance between these impulses. We could begin with Theodor Herzl and his intention to create a cosmopolitan, albeit aristocratic, democracy that would anchor his vision of a Jewish state, very much borrowing from his own Central European ideals. We can look to Herzl's own contemporary, Echad Ha'am, and see his aspiration for a spiritual center that would be the fulfillment of the Zionist project, that would be a light unto the nations. Again, reflecting that, I think, attempt to marry the particularist and universalist impulses rather than to see them as a zero-sum game. One can look at the founding figures of socialist Zionism, from Nachman Sirkin to David Ben-Gurion, and see the marrying of the aspiration to create an egalitarian Jewish society and a society that was of a piece of a larger international order based on principles of justice and fairness. Now, you might say that up to this point, at least in this very brief historical analysis, I've made clear my political colors because I've largely mentioned people associated with the left side of the political spectrum. But here's what's interesting about the historical story. Some of the most robust defenders of democratic and universalist principles are people associated with the Zionist right, beginning and particularly focused on Vladimir Zeb Jabotinsky, the founder of the revisionist Zionist movement. Jabotinsky was as committed to the idea of a robust universalist array of rights for all citizens within a Jewish state as anyone. To be sure, he was a territorial maximalist, and on that I would part ways with him. But his defense of not just the rights of individuals, but the rights of minorities, understanding the excesses of majoritarian democracy, I'm out of time, is one of the most, I'd say, inspiring examples of the democratic impulse in Zionist thought that we see. This is a tradition that extended down through his heir, Menachem Begin, I think, has been realized in the thinking and deeds of the current president of Israel, Ruby Rivlin. What we see today, in terms of that more ethnocentric variant, has lost the balance between universalism and particularism that I believe Zionist thought imparts to us from left to right. So what can we do? And here I'll just very briefly close. We can and should invest in the building up again of democratic ideals in Israel and in the Zionist project. And we can do that in ways that borrow from the example of an organization that has invested in a different set of ideas, the neoconservative ideal. The Tikva Fund has been very successful in investing in a certain set of ideas to animate the Zionist project. And I think we can take inspiration from that and invest in principles that really reflect that perfect counterpoise between particularism and universalism. There's much more to be said, but I'm out of time, so thank you.
I'd like to begin with something in my own biography. I grew up in an Orthodox home, and we'll bring it to a certain point. And then I cared, the fact that I was a woman does happen. I had studied a lot, and I had more or less equal access to studying, but I had no place in the world of ritual by maintaining an Orthodox place. And when I tried to convince, it took a couple of years of me trying to convince people that there is a way to embrace both this feminism and traditional Judaism. And one of the things that kept on getting in the way, and it culminated once in a talk I gave, there was like about 1,000 people, and I was on a panel, and I talked about how, how nationalism in some way could be seen, or was seen by many in the Orthodox community as something that could free religious life and enhance religious life. And then so too, I thought feminism could bring us to a different way of standing with God, in front of God, and enhance Jewish communal life. And I remember a professor of Jewish law from a university got up and just said, Tova. Everybody else was Kvod Harav, the honorary rabbi, and Tova, and said, Zionism is from God, feminism is from the Goyim. And I remember at first, in all honesty, I didn't get it, and I'm not usually so naive, but I really didn't get it. I didn't understand, because it just seemed so clear that, Zionism is the result, of the yearnings, obviously, of the particular Jewish people, but so influenced by this universal, what was universal, notion that every nation deserved to have a state. And it seemed, okay, yeah. But so, and I answered in this naive way and said, was nationalism at Sinai? Because I want to tell you, feminism was not. It's a new notion of what we think about of equality. It isn't inbred in the Jewish tradition. The question is, what happens when the Jewish tradition meets with some of the values of feminism? Can it adapt? Does it have in it to adapt? Does it actually open up aspects of our tradition that can make us even more? And a way in which gave me this kind of encouragement to continue was something that my father, Zichrono Livracha, made me learn off by heart when I was in high school. I didn't go to high school because his idea was that he had to prepare me for going to the army so that I would know how to answer everybody who had a question about being religious. Of course, nobody asked me anything, but that's something. And that was in the introduction of the Shmona Prakim of the Rambam. That's the introduction of Maimonides' book of ethics. And one of the things that it says there is that he says, Maimonides says, I learned many things about ethics from many different philosophers and many different people who were not Jewish. But, excuse me, but I'm not quoting them by name because I know my Jewish people. They will reject what is being said, not by the content, the meaning of what's being said, but by who said it. And then he ends with, V'dai ta'emet mimisha amara. Know the truth by just it being the truth. To just know what truth is and be able to say that that's truth. And so in part, I have a naive, and that may keep me always re-engaging with Jewish tradition, that it has within it the possibility to embrace values that are not ones that we think necessarily define our little particular shtetl at this moment. That it actually, the whole history of Jewish tradition was engaging and re-engaging, adapting and not adapting. I think, I'll talk more from myself, but I think being a religious feminist in that sense was always, I saw, was who decides which universal principle can become a part of our Jewish community and is legitimate, and who not. And so, as I say, the Chafetz Chaim, and this I'll end, someone who interpreted, a very big ultra-Orthodox rabbi who wrote a commentary on the Talmud. And when he got to the idea of women not learning, we're not allowed to study, he says in his commentary, times have changed. And therefore, of course, we can do new things. And I always said, when the Chafetz Chaim says times have changed, times have changed. But when I said times have changed, you have no place, you have to go out. So I think what really the notion of universal values, particular values, it often is what and how do we integrate it into our tradition? What are the methods of doing it? And can we be just also a little more open as to how we can integrate new things? So, thank you.
So there's just not enough time for this conversation. I know all the workshops feel that way, but I feel like we need to sit here for a few hours and let this resonate. What I felt frustrated in a few other places is that people couldn't ask. It all happened up here. So I want to quickly find out if, and you can do it really short, if there is a pressing question, concern. I'm going to take a few hands that are up. Together. So that we can make sure that we have some time for the voices. Questions? Yes. Big voice.
Would it be necessary, would it be helpful to teach particularism before the other one in order to stem the tide of assimilation or intermarriage?
Would it be helpful to teach particularism to stem intermarriage and assimilation or universalism? Do we hear it? Enough? The panelists heard it? I'm going to take a few. No, that's what I'm doing. I'm going to leave this one for a second, but I'd like you, Sue, just a sec. I'd like you to think, and especially in coming to this workshop, where do you struggle with this? Because my hope, and I guess I'm going to throw a question out as a part of these, is I don't want to be just in a theoretical workshop. I talked about these conversations, the lack of tools in our toolbox to have conversations within our families. And I'd like all the speakers to think about that. If you got to give one tool to everyone sitting in this audience to go back to those conversations, what would that tool be? What would that elevator speech be? Because we don't have time for what the longer conversation would be. Sue.
I'm curious about, in the backdrop of what you're talking about in terms of Zionism and particularly younger generation, how this tangle of issues is influenced by American universalism and even American particularism. All, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, etc.
Great.
I'm wondering if in the spectrum of all of thoughts, no matter how divergent, is there a way we can look at these and rather than right and wrong, but different and live together?
There was one up here.
How would you deal with that ultra-Orthodox community? And you have to recognize their humanity, and you're not getting any kind of reciprocity with their community.
I'm letting the speakers grab this all in. I'm not repeating every question so we can have more time up here. And way in the back of the room. Yes?
I'm wondering if you could talk a little about universalism and particularism as tension in the Israeli psyche, because I feel like we hear a lot about universalizing tendencies such as Israelis want to be like everyone else, why can't Jews be like everyone else, be a nation among other nations. So can you talk a little about how that tension plays out in the Israeli context?
I'm going to stop for a sec. Okay. Oh, my daughter asked a question. I'm calling on her. It's my particularism.
Yeah.
There's a lot of discussion on the panel about this in the younger generation. And as a member of the younger generation, do you think that this is just a
Wow, all of it.
Right.
Yehuda.
Been raised well.
Okay. There's a few pieces that I know that other people on this panel are going to address, so I'm going to leave them aside. You know, what I was trying to articulate before, and it goes to the opening question of teaching particularism versus teaching universalism, is I tend to believe that whenever you teach somebody Judaism, you're actually teaching them particularism, regardless of whether the content is what's usually classified as universal values or particular values, and that classification scheme is a highly political way of making judgment about whether you like that Judaism or don't like that Judaism. What do I mean by that? Which Abraham do you like better? Do you like the Abraham of Genesis 18, who argues back with God against what God is doing out of a perceived injustice, and is doing so because he is invested with the responsibility of bringing justice and righteousness to the world, regardless of whom it plays out to? Or do you like better the Abraham of Genesis 22, who is obedient to God in spite of being given an unethical commandment? If you took the particular universal divide, you would say, well, the Abraham of obedience is the Abraham of particularism, and the Abraham who fights with God about the mandate in Sodom is the Abraham of universalism. No, they're actually both the Abraham of particularism. It's just that one of these particularisms imagines that particularism means that the Jewish people have a responsibility to fight for justice and equality, and another particularism is a Judaism that believes that we're supposed to be obedient to God regardless of what we're being instructed to do. The reason why this matters in this context is part of the challenge that we see in our organization in Israel is that when Israelis are introduced in the education system to Judaism and democracy as competing value systems, it's possible for them to come to the conclusion that they are compatible value systems, but push comes to shove, the authentic one is Judaism, and the newer, modern one is democracy. And that conclusion is oftentimes reached by people who themselves are not particularly observant. It's just that they know that one of these is old and venerable. That's the particularism. And democracy, this goes to the story you were telling before, Tova, one of them is new and modern, and therefore it's not significant. In other words, if you want to solve for this problem, the goal is not to simply challenge people to hold Judaism and democracy in tension with each other. The goal is, educationally, to try to educate about how a commitment to those principles that are thought by other people to be universal principles, democracy, religious pluralism, human rights, minority rights, the treatment of the other, those are actually themselves particularistic principles. That's part of what it means to be a Jew. Part of my resistance to the intergenerational piece also is, if a young Jew comes along and says, I have been taught Judaism, to believe, based on my Judaism, to believe that, that as a Jew and as a Zionist, I want to be opposed to the occupation. And the community comes along and says, you are now a universalist who has adapted justice and has abandoned the particular values of your people. It's incoherent. In many cases, it's actually, no, it's because I'm a Jew. It's precisely because I'm a Zionist. It's precisely because I learned Judaism well to believe in the vision of justice and righteousness that I'm advocating for something that comes across to my community as being in contrast to the normative values of nationalism. And I want us to push back against the idea that justice is a particularistic that justice is a universal value and self-preservation is a particularistic value. It actually might be the opposite. And the vehicle by which we can, whether it's an intergenerational gap, is actually, I think, or whether it's an educational challenge, and to your comments before about what to do in Israel, is to actually reject that binary as serving political objectives by people who are anxious about the manifestations of its politics. If we really want a healthier Zionist discourse, we have to start seeing, if you want to see democratic values played out in the context of a Jewish state, we have to take seriously the ways in which those democratic principles are expressions of Jewish values, they are expressions of particularism, and maybe to create the context where engaging on that level, taking each other seriously and investing in a shared discourse might actually produce a better outcome.
So if we have time, we'll get back to it, but is the takeaway to reject the binary? If I have to...
Yeah, it's at least to push against the political motivations of where that binary oftentimes comes from.
So there are too many things floating out here, and not sure what to respond to. But I'll start with Ilana. I actually think it's a great question. You know, my parents were Zionist pioneers. They moved to Palestine to be involved in the Jewish national enterprise. But they were also socialists. They started a kibbutz. The balance that they created between their particularism and universalism was actually real. It was very significant. And it made sense in the context of the times they lived in and the experience that they had. My children's experience is very different. And as much as they've heard the word peoplehood more than any other word at home, you know, they're out saving the world in strange places and doing really interesting things, and they're seeking a new balance because they live in a new context, and they're asking new questions. So it is, in some respect, it is a general, it is a generational issue. The question about Israel, the reason I think that this issue is really important to the American Jewish community because it's seeking the why peoplehood, why Judaism. Why they need a justification, they need a meaning, they need a purpose for the Jewish enterprise. We seem to think we don't have that problem in Israel. But I think that Zionism is really suffering in Israel because, yes, politically, you can get the impression that Zionism is aligning with the right and so on and so forth, and with the national movement. But there's really no fresh Zionist thinking in Israel for a long, long time. It lost its power in that sense. This is why actually the conversation that we are beginning here may be about the relationship between Israelis and world Jews, but it's really, hopefully it will ignite something inside Israel. We have to reconfigure our own ethos today. And at the end of the day, the why question, we have to address it as well. And in that sense, that's my takeaway. There is we can't deal with a practical. We really need to reconfigure what is this all about? Why is it important? What is our ethos? What are we trying to achieve? Why is it meaningful?
So Yehuda mentioned the case of a young generation person who is a Jew and a Zionist and faces the conformist culture of the older generation of the established community. That's not the person I conjure up. I conjure up the younger person who doesn't identify as a Zionist in any way and has real difficulty conjuring up what it means to be a Jew. That's a person of a younger generation who, in a certain sense, has lost the language or doesn't have the language of Jewish commitment and connection. And that's what I see and concerns me a great deal, less the person who can self-identify. And when we think of the loss of that language, I think we have to keep in mind the long arc of modern Jewish history, which from the time of the Enlightenment in the late 18th century really pushed forward the ideal of the individual's autonomy as a sacred principle, the right to choose. And I think that unfettered freedom has indeed led to many creative achievements in the subsequent course of Jewish history, but also has entailed a certain measure of loss of a language that connects one Jew to another. This idea of a kind of unfettered autonomy was described by two scholars in the early 2000s as the instance of the sovereign self, right? The self who is at liberty to decide how she or he sees fit to define him or herself. And I think what we have lost is indeed a sense of the language of responsibility and obligation that came with ideologies like Zionism. We have to remember that we dwell in not just the post-Enlightenment world, but as Daniel Bell instructed us 60 years ago, a post-ideological world. And part of what, this is a kind of prescription that may be disconnected from the aspirations and ideals of the younger generation, but part of what I think we need to do is reinvigorate the very idea of ideology, the yoking of thought to action, which many young people are doing without nonetheless calling it by that name. So it's the case that there are cyclical patterns in modern history between hyper-autonomy and individualization on one hand, and a reaction against that leads to a reconnection to the collective. I think we need to give the pendulum of history a bit of a shove in the direction of the language of responsibility and obligation, and even consider re-embracing the term ideology understood as the yoking of thought to action as a way to invigorate anew and capture. I would add one other thought that's very practical about how we might do that. We can profess in the abstract about the importance of reclaiming a language or reinvigorating ideology. At the end of the day, it will be people-to-people connections that do that. And I want to throw out a very specific ideal that I think allows us to rejigger the balance between universalism and particularism within the context of Israel-diaspora relations. It's been an idea that I've been thinking about for a long time, and fortunately was articulated by the President of Israel in his recent speech at the General Assembly, which is to pair alongside the birthright program a reverse birthright that brings Israelis to the United States and other places than diaspora to expose them to the political and social culture of diaspora communities, to expose them to pluralistic variants of Judaism, and then to bring the groups together so that they actually mutually fructify and fertilize each other.
I would like to suggest, though, that that autonomy is actually an ideology. There was an ideology of autonomy that much of feminist psychology and feminist literature really critiqued and said it really doesn't necessarily reflect human need. So I just think it's important to put it that it's not, that against that. Some of the people here had asked what happens with minorities in Israel, some said, who don't necessarily respect other people. What is our relationship to, let's say, ultra-Orthodox communities who do not respect my way of life? They do not, what kind of pluralism or what kind of community building can we have with people who don't necessarily only have a different narrative, but a narrative that says, you really, if I had power, for sure you wouldn't be here, but we really don't respect who you are. And I think that that's, in the sense in Israel, it's on one hand with the ultra-Orthodox as an ideology. Of course, individuals, I teach many, we have many ultra-Orthodox students in our campuses, and engaging with them on a daily basis is always different than what you hear from the rabbis. But there's another community in Israel, and that's the relationship with our Arab minorities, who, after one gets to know them, they are not an Arab minority, but so many multiple Arab minorities, and each village really doesn't get along with the other village, et cetera, whose narrative, as much as I can say I can be respectful to them, or they might be respectful in some way, or say I may want to partake in aspects of modern Israel. However, their narrative is that I have taken their land and I am a conqueror to them. How do I engage with that? And in their language as well, and in their practice, you have no place here. I mean, in the sense of what I had said at the beginning, is that zero-sum game mentality that takes place in Israel. And I think as I see here in the States, of course, I'm a visitor here, but when I read the newspapers, it's remarkable of how we are actually more mirroring each other than I would. I used to say, okay, we have to export some kids from Israel to learn democracy. I think we're sort of all in a similar kind of challenge, what one say, about the delegitimization of the other. And how do we engage with each other when the narratives really aren't just, okay, you're nice, I'm nice, we have this vision, you have that vision, but they really conflict at the very core of what it means to be a citizen in that country. And I think that is something that I know we're all struggling with, and I think, as I understand now, it's not that I'm so happy that America's as well struggling with some of these things, but I think that it really is not how do I accept that other or how do I engage with that when that other really does not see me as a legitimate partner for all the right, the justified and non-justified reasons that there are.
So I hope this is not asking too much, each with like 1 minute.
Sure.
But if, when I first put out this panel topic to the panelists, there was pushback from all, right? About I want to change the structure and the way that particularism and universalism are being, kind of in a fighting manner. And I have a perspective, each of you, that there's a greater synergy. So my question is, if we got to have the next workshop that followed, and we got to create this into an action item, a workshop and an action item, what would it read like? What would be the title of Universalism and Particularism 2.0 for the participants here as they leave?
The question I would want to ask and work on is, how do we advance a vision for a thick and authentic Judaism in America and in Israel that reflects the best of our moral aspirations and ambitions? I think that's so much part of what American Jews kind of take for granted of what Jewish education is supposed to be. I think it's a more vexed question in Israeli society because Judaism there includes the apparatus of a state and not just moral values in a vacuum. But I think sometimes we in the American Jewish community fail to understand how a state can be part of advancing a thick vision for Judaism that reflects the best of our moral aspirations. Then, without using that dichotomy, I still want a thick and authentic Judaism. I just want that thick and authentic Judaism in both America and Israel reflects the best of our moral aspirations.
Would the vocabulary of universalism and particularism be rejected from the conversation?
I think there's a way to study it in ways that understand the way that these ideas fuel each other, as opposed to understanding that those are like the goalposts of the conversation.
Shlomi?
Heavy. So I actually, and this is something that in the last 2 years of working in the Bay Area, I've learned about Jewish people more than I've learned in the previous decade. Mostly because I didn't come to the folks that I worked with and I said, here is the list of, here are the values of peoplehood and all that, kazer eve kadesh. But I basically said, okay, you don't resonate with the way the previous generation saw it, articulate your vision. And I think we should have some trust, both in our people and also in our destiny, to actually open those questions and have the Jews come up with a relevant. We shouldn't get stuck with the old answers. We shouldn't get stuck with the old frames. But we should, as leadership, we should at least frame the questions directly, courageously. Nothing. Think we don't have to hold on to sacred cows, but open them up and have people come up with answers. You'll be surprised as to how enriching this can be. And maybe we'll come up with some good answers, too.
So there is indeed a grave crisis afflicting democracy in the world today. And the United States and Israel belong to that moment of crisis. And yet I would ask different questions of the two societies, mindful of the similarities between them. Of Israel, I would ask, how can we reclaim the liberal democratic values that I believe were once rooted in Zionism and have been lost and threatened to disable it for a very long time? And in the United States, I would ask, how can we reclaim that tradition, which was given very explicit and concrete and succinct formulation by one of my favorite Jewish thinkers, Shimon Ravidovich, when he called for what he called libertas differendi, the right to be different. It was a vital ingredient in both the fabric of Jewish life and the fabric of the human condition. That's the question I would ask of America.
I would like to ask, in Israel, how can we look honestly, and in the sense I would disagree with you because I think the first, let's say from 48 to 67, were some of the really, really painful human rights violations in the state of Israel to its minorities. They're not talked about as much. There could be the Zionist ideology of universalist values, which did come in kibbutz, but how can we look honestly about what happened and the serious human rights violations, and how do we move on from there, knowing it, and yet continuing to love and demand a just Jewish state in Israel?
I'd like to thank the incredible panelists. I'd like to invite you all over for Shabbat and continue the conversation. My hope is that today won't be just a theoretical session. I guess my challenge to you as we go forward trying to find a common destiny and ethos is that you'll take this conversation and you'll find someone that you have found it challenging to have this type of conversation with before. And hopefully hear a little of Tova and David and Shlomi and Yehuda in your head and try to begin the conversation again and struggle through it. I think the experience of many, many people that I have talked to prior to this session was that the conversation happens internally over and over and over again, sometimes to the point of great frustration, and that what we aren't engaged in is an exchange of thoughts and ideas, especially when we disagree with each other. But this is a painful process. We've heard it all day. We're in a new time period where we need new language, a new framework, a new ability to have a conversation. So whether you take it or not, I challenge you, go find a friend, your daughter, your grandchild, grab a cup of coffee, and continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.